At exactly 7:18 a.m., Jean Brooks stood inside Chicago's Union Station, staring at the cracked screen of her old phone. The battery had fallen to 8%, just enough she hoped to make one last call to her 9-year-old son before school. Then, an exhausted older man rushed toward her, breathless, asking for only 2 minutes to borrow it. Everyone else turned away. Jean hesitated, then placed the phone into his trembling hands. 3 days later, detectives and 2 attorneys walked into the office building where she cleaned floors at night, asking for her by name. That single phone call, they said, had protected something worth more than $2 million. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. And if stories about ordinary kindness changing extraordinary lives speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this. The apartment building where Jean Brooks lived stood on the west side of Chicago, squeezed between an aging laundromat and a corner grocery that still accepted handwritten tabs from neighbors who came up short before payday. The brick walls had long surrendered their original color to years of wind, rain, and winter salt. The elevator hadn't worked in nearly 4 months, so every morning after finishing her night shift, Jean climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs with aching knees and a pair of cleaning shoes that had lost most of their grip. Apartment 3C was small enough that the kitchen table nearly touched the living room couch. The wallpaper peeled quietly near the window, and one radiator hissed like an old kettle whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. Yet every surface inside the apartment carried signs of care rather than neglect. Lucas's school drawings covered the refrigerator door. A tiny basil plant sat beside the kitchen sink. Every Saturday, Jean washed the curtains by hand, because replacing them simply wasn't an option. She believed dignity was something a person practiced, especially when no one else noticed. Most mornings began the same way. At 5:45 p.m., while much of the city was preparing dinner, Jean left for work carrying a faded navy backpack and a homemade turkey sandwich wrapped carefully in wax paper. She cleaned 12 floors inside one of downtown Chicago's tallest office buildings. Her responsibilities were invisible to almost everyone who entered those polished hallways each morning. Empty trash bins, vacuumed carpets, spotless glass doors, restrooms that somehow seemed to clean themselves overnight. People rarely looked at the woman pushing the gray janitor's cart. They noticed only when something hadn't been done. Angela Morris, the supervisor of the cleaning crew, often reminded the team, "If nobody notices your work, you've probably done it perfectly." Jean would smile every time she heard it. She never complained about the hours. She never complained about the sore back that lingered after every shift. She simply worked. Not because she loved cleaning office buildings, but because every paycheck meant Lucas could stay in the neighborhood school where his teachers already understood his asthma. Lucas Brooks was only 9 years old, but life had taught him lessons many adults still struggled to learn. He knew which inhaler belonged in his backpack. He knew not to run too hard during recess. He knew that when his chest tightened, panic only made breathing harder. Most importantly, he knew his mother would always call before the first school bell, every single morning. It didn't matter whether she was exhausted, or whether the train was late, or whether she had worked overtime. At exactly the same time every weekday, Jane called. It lasted less than a minute. "Morning, buddy." "Morning, Mom." "You remember your inhaler?" "Already checked." "What do we always say?" Lucas always smiled before answering. "One call can change a day." Jen would laugh softly. "It sure can." Only then would they hang up. The ritual had started years earlier after Lucas experienced a frightening asthma attack during kindergarten. Jean had been unreachable because her old phone battery had died halfway through her overnight shift. By the time she reached the hospital, she had already imagined every terrible possibility. She bought a used replacement phone the following month. It wasn't new. The screen had a long crack, stretching across the upper right corner. The battery barely lasted half a day. Sometimes it froze without warning, but to June it was the most valuable thing she owned. Not because of what it was, because of what it allowed. One call, every morning, no matter what. She skipped buying coffee so she could afford another prepaid phone card. She delayed replacing her worn winter boots to keep her service active another month. Even when money became painfully tight, she never allowed the phone to be disconnected. She often joked that the phone worked harder than either of them. Lucas would grin. "I think it likes us." "Maybe," Jean replied. "Or maybe it knows somebody still needs it." Neither of them realized how true those words would soon become. That Thursday morning had begun like every other. At 4:52 a.m., Jean emptied the final recycling bin on the 34th floor. At 5:30, she polished fingerprints from the executive conference room windows while watching the first hint of sunrise reflect against Lake Michigan. At 6:08, Angela handed everyone their timesheets. "You staying for overtime tomorrow?" Angela asked. Jean hesitated. "If Lucas is feeling okay, yes." "You need the hours." "I know," Angela nodded sympathetically. Everyone on the cleaning crew needed the hours. John checked the balance in her checking account while waiting for the employee exit doors to unlock. $312. Rent was due in 5 days. Lucas's asthma prescription needed refilling before Monday. The electric bill sat folded inside her backpack, still unpaid. She quietly did the math in her head for what felt like the 100th time. Something would have to wait. She simply hadn't decided what. Outside, cool morning air brushed against her face. Chicago was waking up. Buses rumbled past. Street vendors unlocked metal carts. Office workers hurried toward train platforms carrying expensive coffee cups. Jean slipped her phone from her pocket. 8% battery remained. Enough. She smiled. Just enough for Lucas. She pressed the phone gently against her palm, as if reassuring herself it was still there. The cracked glass caught the early sunlight. She whispered the same words she always did before heading toward Union Station. "One call can change a day." With that, Jean adjusted the strap of her backpack, joined the growing crowd flowing toward the station, and unknowingly stepped into the morning that would change far more than a single day. Union Station was already alive by the time Jean stepped through its heavy glass doors. The giant hall echoed with rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, train announcements, and conversations that dissolved into one another beneath the vaulted ceiling. Morning commuters moved with practiced urgency, their eyes fixed on departure boards, coffee cups, or glowing phone screens. Nobody wanted to lose even 30 seconds. Jean became another face in the current flowing toward the commuter platforms. She glanced once more at her phone. 7%. She frowned. The battery had dropped another point while sitting in her pocket. Still enough, she reassured herself. Lucas's school didn't start for another 12 minutes. If she waited until she reached the platform, she could make the call before boarding the train home. She wrapped both hands around the phone, as though protecting it from the cold. Just then, a loud voice cut through the crowd. "Please, excuse me, could someone help me?" Few people even turned their heads. An older man, his gray overcoat slightly wrinkled, and his breathing uneven, hurried from one traveler to another. His silver hair had been pushed out of place by the wind, and one sleeve of his coat carried a dark streak of dirt, as though someone had shoved him against a wall. He stopped beside a businessman in an expensive navy suit. "I'm sorry to bother you," the older man said politely. "My wallet and phone were stolen. I only need to make one call." The businessman tightened his grip on his briefcase. "Not interested." He kept walking. The older man thanked him anyway. A young woman wearing wireless earbuds didn't even remove one earbud when he approached. "I just need 2 minutes." Without making eye contact, she shook her head. "No." Another man muttered, "Nice story." Someone else laughed quietly. One commuter whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "It's probably another scam." The words floated through the station like smoke. Jean slowed her pace. She watched the older man continue asking strangers with the same quiet dignity each time. No anger, no begging, only hope. His eyes were tired rather than desperate. There was something unusual about him. People pretending to be victims often talked too much, adding dramatic details before anyone asked questions. This man simply repeated the same sentence. I only need one phone call. Nothing more, nothing less. He reached an elderly couple. They apologized sincerely. We're so sorry. Our battery's dead. He smiled kindly. I understand. Then he turned toward another group. Jean found herself walking more slowly. Her thumb rested against the cracked corner of her own phone. 7%. She pictured Lucas sitting in his classroom backpack hanging from the side of his chair, quietly waiting for his mother's familiar call. He would never complain if she missed it. That somehow made the promise feel even more important. The older man suddenly stopped. He slipped one hand into his empty coat pocket before remembering there was nothing left inside it. For the first time, discouragement crossed his face. He looked toward the enormous station clock. 7:21 a.m. His shoulders lowered. Whatever he needed to do seemed connected to time. Jan almost continued walking, almost. She told herself there were dozens of people around. Someone else would surely help. Someone with a newer phone. Someone with a full battery. Someone who didn't have a child waiting. But no one stopped. The crowd simply flowed around him like water around a stone. Invisible. Jean remembered something Lucas had asked only a week earlier. Mom, how does somebody become lonely if they're standing around thousands of people? She hadn't answered immediately. Finally, she'd said, sometimes loneliness isn't about being alone. Sometimes it's about nobody seeing you. Now watching the strangers pass the older man without even meeting his eyes, those words returned with unexpected force. The station announcement echoed overhead. Final boarding for train 218. The older man took a slow breath and prepared to ask yet another stranger. Jean stepped forward. Sir. He turned. Their eyes met. She held up the old phone. It's not much. He looked confused. The battery's almost gone. I only have a few minutes before I need to call my son. But you can use it. For a moment, the older man simply stared at her. Not because of the phone, because someone had finally stopped. You'd trust me with this? He asked softly. Jean gave a small smile. I'd like to think somebody would trust my father. The older man's expression changed. A mixture of relief and gratitude settled across his face. Thank you. He accepted the phone carefully with both hands as though it were something precious. Not expensive. Precious. He quickly entered a number from memory. John noticed how steady his fingers remained despite everything. He wasn't calling the police. He wasn't calling a family member. He pressed the phone to his ear. After one ring, someone answered. Rebecca? His voice became calm. It's William. I found a phone. Listen carefully. Jane respectfully looked away, giving him privacy. She caught only fragments. Don't sign. Before 8. Tell everyone to wait. I'm on my way. Yes, I'm certain. The entire conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, releasing a breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for hours. When he handed the phone back, the battery indicator flashed 6%. I'm afraid I used a little more than I promised. Jean smiled. I think I'll still make my call. I hope so. William hesitated before speaking again. I don't know how to thank you. You already did. By giving it back, Jean replied with a quiet laugh. He smiled for the first time. A genuine smile. What you gave me this morning may matter more than you realize. Jean shrugged. It was only a phone. William looked at the cracked screen one last time. No. He shook his head gently. It was trust. Before Jean could ask what he meant, the announcement for her train echoed across the station. She nodded politely. I should go. So should I. They walked in opposite directions without exchanging last names, phone numbers, or expectations of ever meeting again. Jean hurried toward her platform, unlocked her phone, and dialed the number she knew by heart. Lucas answered on the second ring. "Morning, Mom." Jean smiled, hearing the warmth in his voice. "Morning, buddy. You remember your inhaler?" "Already checked. What do we always say?" Lucas laughed. "One call can change a day." Jean looked back once across the crowded station, but the older man had already disappeared into the sea of strangers. She had no way of knowing that somewhere across the city, Rebecca Collins had just stood up from a conference table, interrupted a meeting worth millions of dollars, and told every executive in the room 5 words that changed everything. "Stop! William just called." By the following Monday morning, the encounter at Union Station had already begun to blur into the countless ordinary moments that filled Jean Brooks's life. There were lunches to pack, laundry that refused to fold itself, bills waiting in neat, unforgiving stacks on the corner of the kitchen table. The old phone, now fully charged again, rested beside a grocery receipt covered with handwritten calculations. Jean had circled the prices of milk-bred eggs and Lucas's asthma medication so many times that the ink had nearly torn through the paper. She stared at the numbers. If she paid the electric bill that week, the prescription would have to wait. If she bought the inhaler refill first, she would be late on rent. Neither choice felt acceptable. "Mom." Lucas wandered into the kitchen wearing his oversized school sweatshirt, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You forgot your tea." Jean smiled and slid a warm mug toward him. "I guess I did." Lucas noticed the papers. "You doing math again? The kind nobody likes." He climbed onto the chair across from her. "When I get older, I'll help." Jean reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I know you will. But your job right now is being 9. He grinned. "I think I'm pretty good at that." She laughed quietly. "You really are." Moments like that reminded her why she never allowed herself to surrender to exhaustion. After walking Lucas to the neighborhood bus stop, Jean caught the Green Line downtown for another evening shift. The office tower looked exactly as it always had. Mirrored windows, marble lobby, employees who hurried past without noticing the people preparing the building for another day. Angela Morris handed Jean a clipboard. "Conference rooms on 22 need extra attention tonight." "Big meeting tomorrow." Angela nodded. "Apparently." Jean didn't ask questions. Executives held important meetings every week. Their decisions rarely reached the people emptying their trash cans. Hours passed in familiar rhythm. Vacuum, dust, disinfect, repeat. Around midnight, Jean paused outside a conference room whose floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago River. City lights shimmered across the water like scattered stars. Sometimes she imagined the conversations that happened inside rooms like this. $1 million investments, corporate mergers, expansion plans, entire companies changing direction. She wondered what it felt like to make decisions that large. Then she smiled at herself. The only major decision waiting for her tomorrow involved choosing between paying the internet bill or replacing Lucas's worn-out winter gloves. Life had a way of keeping perspective simple. Across the city, however, another meeting had become anything but ordinary. Inside the headquarters of Carter Community Foundation, folders lay open across a polished walnut table. Rebecca Collins stood beside a large screen displaying legal documents. "The transfer has been suspended," she announced. Several board members exchanged puzzled looks. Thomas Green folded his arms. "We were 5 minutes away from final authorization." Rebecca nodded. "I know." "And we stopped because William called from an unknown number." She looked directly at Thomas. "He confirmed there was information we hadn't received." Thomas frowned. "So someone delayed a $2 million property transfer with one phone call," Rebecca answered calmly. "Yes." No one spoke. William Carter sat quietly near the end of the table. He had changed into a fresh suit after returning home that morning. but he still couldn't stop thinking about the woman with the cracked phone. He remembered how carefully she had warned him about the battery, how naturally she had trusted someone every other stranger had dismissed. He had spent decades building charitable programs, yet he couldn't remember the last time someone had helped him expecting absolutely nothing in return. Rebecca continued presenting updated reports. The community center remains operational. The after-school programs continue. The job training classes continue. The emergency food pantry remains open. Each sentence represented hundreds of families. William looked towards the windows. For the first time in years, the spreadsheets felt secondary to the people behind them. His thoughts drifted back to Union Station. He hadn't even learned the woman's name. Meanwhile, June's week became increasingly difficult. Thursday afternoon, while Lucas was finishing homework, he suddenly stopped reading aloud. His breathing changed. Jean recognized the sound immediately. "Lucas." He reached for his chest. "My inhaler." She already had it in her hand. Within minutes, they were sitting inside the pediatric urgent care clinic. The doctor listened carefully to Lucas's lungs before offering reassuring news. He responded quickly. "Fortunately, but this inhaler is almost empty." Jean nodded. "I know. You'll need a refill within the next few days." "I'll get it." She smiled politely. Only she knew she hadn't yet figured out how. At the pharmacy counter, the technician scanned the prescription. "The total is $94.60. Jean's smile faded for only a fraction of a second. "I'll come back tomorrow." The technician looked sympathetic. "We can hold it for 7 days." Jean thanked her. Outside, Lucas quietly walked beside her. He had heard everything. "You don't have to buy it today." Jean stopped walking. She knelt until they were eye level. "I do. It's important. I feel okay." "You do." She gently brushed a curl away from his forehead. "And I'm going to keep it that way." Lucas didn't argue. He simply slipped his small hand into hers. Back at the apartment, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Jean opened the kitchen drawer where she kept every unpaid bill. She added the pharmacy receipt on top. For a long moment, she simply stared at the growing pile. Then she reached for her old phone. The cracked screen reflected the kitchen light. She smiled despite herself. "One call can change a day." She whispered the familiar words almost automatically. This time they sounded less certain. She wondered whether they were still true. Across town, William Carter was asking Rebecca a question that would quietly change the course of both their lives. "Can we identify the phone number I borrowed that morning?" Rebecca looked up from her notes. "The one from Union Station." William nodded. "I owe someone more than a thank you." Rebecca reached for the legal file containing the temporary call records. "I think," she said softly, "we can find her." Friday evening arrived with cold rain sweeping across downtown Chicago, turning sidewalks into ribbons of reflected traffic lights. Jean Brooks pulled the hood of her worn jacket over her head as she hurried toward the office tower where she worked. The weather reminded her that winter was approaching faster than her savings account could manage. She had picked up Lucas from school only an hour earlier. He had quietly slipped a folded paper into her backpack before she left for work. "Don't read it until you're on break," he had whispered. Now, during her 15-minute lunch break, shortly after midnight, Jean unfolded the paper while sitting alone in the employee break room. It was a drawing. Lucas had sketched the two of them holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Between them was the familiar old phone with tiny lightning bolts around it. Above the picture, he had written in careful handwriting, "Our phone is old, but it always finds me." Jean smiled. Then she noticed another sentence beneath it. "Thank you for never forgetting to call." Her eyes lingered on those words longer than she expected. She carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into the same pocket where she kept her phone. Neither would leave her side again. The rest of the shift passed quietly until nearly 4 in the morning. Angela Morris approached while Jean was polishing stainless steel elevator doors. "You have visitors?" Jean looked up in surprise. "Visitors?" Angela nodded. "They've been asking for you." "At 4 in the morning." I thought it was strange, too. Jean wiped her hands on a cleaning towel and followed Angela toward the lobby. 2 people stood near the reception desk. A man wearing a dark suit, a woman carrying a leather briefcase. Neither looked like police officers. Neither looked familiar. As Jean approached, both turned toward her. The woman offered a professional smile. "Miss Jean Brooks." "Yes. My name is Rebecca Collins." She extended her hand. "I'm an attorney." Jean hesitated before shaking it. "And this is David Ellis." The man nodded politely. "We apologize for arriving during your shift." Jean's stomach tightened. "Is something wrong?" Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with David. "We're hoping you can answer a few questions." "About what?" "About a phone call made from your mobile phone last Thursday morning." Jean immediately remembered Union Station. The older man, William. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Oh, the gentleman who borrowed my phone." Rebecca noticed the change in Joan's expression. "So you do remember him?" "Of course." "He only used it for a minute or two." David opened a thin folder. "Can you describe him?" Jean frowned. "He was older. Very polite. He said someone had stolen his wallet and phone. I let him make one call." Rebecca listened carefully. "Did he identify himself?" Jean shook her head. "No." "Did he ask for your name?" "No." "Did he promise you anything?" "No." "Did he offer money?" Jean almost laughed. "He thanked me." That was all. Rebecca slowly closed the folder. Everything Jean had said matched the records perfectly. Angela watched from several feet away, pretending to organize supply shelves, while obviously trying to hear every word. Jean noticed. "So," she looked back at Rebecca. "Why are you here?" Before Rebecca could answer, another voice interrupted. "Excuse me." A uniformed Chicago police officer entered through the revolving doors. "I was told I'd find Attorney Collins here." Jean's heartbeat quickened. Police Rebecca greeted him. "Officer Ramirez." The officer nodded. "I've completed the identity verification." Then he noticed Jean. "You must be Miss Brooks." Jean instinctively straightened. "Yes." The officer smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry. You're not in any trouble." Those words should have comforted her. Instead, they made her even more confused. "If I'm not in trouble, why is everyone looking for me?" Officer Ramirez explained gently. "When your phone number appeared in legal records connected to a multi-million-dollar property transaction, standard procedure required us to verify whether your device had been stolen, cloned, or used without your knowledge." Jean blinked. "I'm sorry. I don't understand." "Multi-million-dollar faux," Rebecca stepped forward. "The gentleman you helped made an extremely important legal call. It prevented the final approval of a major transaction." Jean stared silently. She had expected almost any explanation except that one. "I only let him borrow my phone." "We know." "That's exactly why we're here." Jean looked down at the cracked screen resting in her hand. It suddenly felt strangely heavy. "I don't know anything about business. I clean offices." Rebecca smiled kindly. "We're very aware of that. And we're not investigating you. We're trying to find someone." "The man?" Jean asked. Rebecca nodded. "His name is William Carter." Jean repeated it quietly. "William." The name sounded oddly familiar, though she couldn't remember why. David spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Have you had any contact with him since that morning?" "No." "Did he leave a phone number?" "No." "An address?" "No. He simply gave me my phone back." Rebecca thanked her. We didn't expect more. Jean looked from one face to another. Can somebody please tell me what happened? Rebecca hesitated. I'm afraid I can't discuss the legal details yet. But I can tell you this. Mr. Carter has been trying to find you. Jean frowned. Why? Rebecca answered honestly. Because he believes your kindness changed the outcome of something very important. Before June could ask another question, Angela quietly walked over, carrying Jean's backpack. You should take your break, she said softly. Then, after the visitors stepped aside, Angela leaned close enough that only Jean could hear. I've worked here 19 years. I've never seen lawyers and police looking for one of my cleaners. Jean let out a nervous laugh. Neither have I. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she handed Jean a business card. If Mr. Carter contacts us first, may we tell him how to reach you? Jean looked at the card for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. Yes. I think... She glanced once more at the cracked phone in her hand. I'd like to know why one phone call matters so much. Rebecca smiled. I believe you'll find out very soon. Jean watched the three visitors disappear into the rainy Chicago dawn, completely unaware that only a few blocks away, William Carter was already stepping out of a black sedan, determined to thank the woman who had unknowingly saved far more than a building. Jean barely slept after finishing her shift. The questions followed her home like shadows. Why would a wealthy businessman be searching for a night janitor? Why had attorneys and a police officer appeared over a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes? Most of all, what had William Carter meant when he said that her kindness mattered more than she realized? The apartment was unusually quiet that afternoon. Lucas sat at the kitchen table coloring planets for a science project, while Jean reheated leftover vegetable soup. She kept glancing at the business card Rebecca Collins had given her. It rested beside the salt shaker, its crisp white edges looking strangely out of place among chipped dishes and unpaid bills. Lucas noticed. Is that from the lawyer? Jean smiled weakly. You heard about that already. Mrs. Wilson downstairs said 2 fancy people came looking for you. Jean laughed despite herself. News travels fast in this building. Lucas tilted his head. Did you do something wrong? She immediately crossed the room and knelt beside him. No. Then why do you look worried? Jean paused before answering. Sometimes, when something unusual happens, your mind invents problems before your heart catches up. Lucas considered that. That's a very grown-up sentence. She kissed the top of his head. I know. At exactly 3:40 that afternoon, someone knocked on the apartment door. Not loudly. Just 3 calm, deliberate knocks. Jean looked through the peephole. Standing in the hallway was the older man from Union Station. He wore a charcoal overcoat instead of the wrinkled gray one from that morning at the station. Beside him stood Rebecca Collins, holding the same leather briefcase. Jean opened the door cautiously. William smiled. I was hoping you'd remember me. I do. You found me. I had help. He glanced toward Rebecca. I couldn't have done it without her. Jean stepped aside. It's a small apartment. William looked around with genuine appreciation rather than discomfort. I've lived in smaller. Jean wasn't sure whether to believe him. Lucas peeked around the kitchen doorway. Mom, Jean smiled. This is the man who borrowed my phone. Lucas's eyes widened. The famous phone call. William laughed warmly. I didn't realize I'd become famous. Lucas walked over and extended his hand with surprising confidence. I'm Lucas. William shook it respectfully. It's a pleasure to meet you. There was no air of importance about him. No expensive watch flashed for attention. No bodyguards waited outside. He looked less like a powerful businessman and more like someone's favorite grandfather. Jean invited them to sit. She apologized for not having coffee. William waved away the apology. I didn't come for coffee. He rested both hands on his knees. I came to tell you the truth. The room fell silent. William looked directly at Jean. My name is William Carter. I founded Carter Community Foundation nearly 30 years ago. Jean frowned. I've heard that name. Rebecca nodded. Our foundation operates community centers throughout Illinois. Recognition slowly appeared on John's face. The one on Madison Street. Yes. My cousin took GED classes there years ago. William smiled. Then you've already seen a small part of what we do. Jean leaned forward. And the phone call. William's expression grew serious. Last Thursday morning, our board was preparing to finalize the sale of that community center. Jean looked confused. Why would you sell it? I believed it had become financially unsustainable. Rebecca quietly opened a folder. The reports looked convincing. But they were incomplete, William continued. I had discovered critical information the night before. A development company purchasing the property intended to demolish the center within 6 months. John's eyebrows lifted. They told you something different. They promised to preserve community programs, Rebecca answered. They lied. William nodded slowly. My phone was stolen before I could reach the board. I had less than 40 minutes. If they signed before 8 o'clock, he stopped. The building would have been gone. Jean slowly understood. So, my phone, William finished her sentence, allowed me to stop the signing. Rebecca slid several photographs across the table. Jean picked up the first one, children eating breakfast inside a bright cafeteria. The second showed teenagers learning computer programming. The third showed women practicing interviews in a career workshop. There are over 1,200 people who use that building every month, Rebecca said quietly. After-school tutoring, job training, food assistance, mental health counseling, veteran support. John turned each photograph carefully. One image showed a young mother reading with her daughter in a colorful children's library. Another showed volunteers distributing winter coats. She swallowed. I thought it was just one building. William shook his head. It's hundreds of stories happening inside one building. He looked toward Lucas. There are children there every afternoon. Some wait for parents working late shifts. Some receive their only hot meal after school. Lucas listened without saying a word. William looked back at Jean. If you hadn't stopped, Jean interrupted softly. No. If nobody had stopped. William smiled. Fair enough. They both knew what she meant. For a moment, neither spoke. Then William reached into his coat pocket and removed something unexpected. It wasn't a check. It wasn't cash. It was John's phone number, handwritten on a small piece of legal paper. I asked Rebecca to trace only this. He placed it gently on the table. I wanted permission before I learned anything else about you. Jean stared at him. You could have just looked me up. I could have. But kindness deserves respect. I wasn't willing to repay trust by invading your privacy. The words settled quietly over the room. Jean realized she had misjudged powerful people for almost as long as powerful people had overlooked someone like her. Not everyone used influence carelessly. William glanced once more around the apartment. His eyes lingered on the stack of unpaid bills, though he pretended not to notice. Instead, he looked at the drawing Lucas had taped to the refrigerator, the old phone, the yellow sun, the words, "Our phone is old, but it always finds me." William smiled gently. I think your son understands something many adults never learn. Jean followed his gaze. He says our phone always finds him. William nodded. And last Thursday. It found us, too. He stood slowly. I'd like to show you something tomorrow. What? The place your phone helped save. Jean looked from William to Rebecca, then toward Lucas. She didn't yet realize that walking through the doors of the Madison Street Community Center the following morning would quietly begin changing the direction of her own life. Saturday morning arrived with unusually clear skies. After nearly a week of gray clouds and cold rain, Chicago seemed to breathe differently beneath bright autumn sunlight. Jean stood outside the Madison Street Community Center with one hand resting lightly on Lucas's shoulder. The building was older than she had imagined. Its red brick walls carried decades of weather, but colorful murals painted by neighborhood children stretched across one side of the entrance. Flowers still bloomed in raised wooden planters despite the cooling temperatures. Above the front doors hung a simple blue sign: Madison Street Community Center, everyone welcome. William Carter waited near the entrance instead of inside. When he saw Jean and Lucas approaching, he smiled as though greeting old friends rather than guests. "I'm glad you came." Jean looked at the building. "I wanted to see what one phone call actually protected." William nodded. "So did I." Jean gave him a puzzled look. He chuckled softly. "I've seen reports for years. I realized recently that reports aren't the same as people." Rebecca Collins joined them, carrying nothing more than a notebook instead of the thick, legal folders she always seemed to have. "Today," she said warmly, "there are no meetings. No lawyers. No contracts. Just stories." William opened the front door himself. "After you." The first thing Jean noticed was the sound. Laughter. Not loud or chaotic, but steady, comfortable laughter echoing through the hallways. The building felt alive. A teenage volunteer hurried past carrying boxes of donated books. An elderly woman arranged fresh apples inside a food pantry. A father knelt beside his daughter, helping her zip up a backpack before leaving a reading room. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody seemed invisible. Lucas's eyes wandered everywhere. "It's bigger than my school." William smiled. "Some days it feels like one." Their first stop was a classroom where about 15 elementary school children sat around colorful tables, building model bridges from wooden craft sticks. A young instructor looked up. "Mr. Carter?" William shook his head gently. "Today I'm just William." The instructor laughed. "Good luck convincing the kids of that." One little boy immediately ran toward William. "Look!" He proudly held up a crooked bridge. "It only broke twice." William crouched until they were eye level. "The best engineers usually fail more than twice." The boy grinned. Jean watched quietly. There was no performance in William's kindness, no audience, no photographers, just genuine attention. As they continued walking, William stopped outside another room. "This one matters to me." Jean looked inside. About 20 adults sat at computers, while an instructor explained spreadsheet software projected onto a screen. Most were women. Some wore nursing uniforms, others wore restaurant aprons or warehouse jackets. One woman bounced a sleeping baby gently in a stroller while typing with one hand. "What class is this?" Jean asked. Rebecca answered. "Career transition. Many of them work overnight. They're learning office software, bookkeeping, and customer service so they can qualify for better-paying jobs." Jean remained silent. She recognized the exhaustion on their faces. It looked exactly like the reflection she saw in her own bathroom mirror after every night shift. One woman noticed Jean standing in the doorway. She walked over during a short break. "Are you visiting?" Jean nodded. "Just looking around." The woman smiled. "My name's Denise. I used to clean hotel rooms. Now I'm studying payroll management." Jean smiled back. "How long have you been coming here?" 8 months. "And next week?" Denise's eyes filled with excitement. "I have my first interview." Without thinking, Jean hugged her. It surprised both of them. When they separated, Denise laughed. "I guess I needed that." "So did I," Jean admitted. As they walked farther into the building, Lucas disappeared into a children's reading room. Jean instinctively started after him. William gently touched her arm. "Watch." Lucas had already sat beside a younger boy struggling through a picture book. Patiently, he began helping him sound out difficult words. Jean smiled proudly. "He does that at school, too." William watched silently. "He learned it somewhere." Jean answered without hesitation. "No. He taught himself." William glanced at her. "I don't believe children teach themselves kindness. They borrow it." His words stayed with Jean long after they moved to the next room. Near the back of the building stood the community kitchen. The smell of fresh vegetable soup filled the air. Several volunteers packed containers for elderly residents unable to cook for themselves. One older volunteer handed Lucas a warm dinner roll straight from the oven. "Growing boys need fuel." Lucas looked toward Jean. She nodded. "Go ahead." He thanked the volunteer before taking a bite. William smiled. "You've taught him manners." Jen laughed softly. "My grandmother would haunt me if I hadn't." Finally, William led them upstairs to a large room overlooking the neighborhood. The walls were covered with photographs taken over nearly 30 years. Graduation ceremonies, holiday meals, blood drives, job fairs, music performances. Children who had once attended after-school tutoring now appeared years later wearing college graduation gowns. One framed photograph caught Jean's attention. A young mother stood beside a little girl outside the center. Both were smiling. The date beneath the picture read October 2004. William noticed her studying it. Her name was Melissa. Jean looked at him. She escaped an abusive relationship with her daughter. The center helped her finish nursing school. He pointed toward another photo taken years later. The same woman now wore hospital scrubs. "She's an emergency room supervisor today." Jean slowly walked along the wall. Every photograph represented someone whose life had quietly changed. No headlines, no television interviews, just ordinary people finding another chance. William stood beside her. This building was never about bricks. It was always about possibilities. Jean whispered almost to herself. And it almost disappeared. William nodded. It did. Rebecca stepped closer. If the papers had been signed that morning. She looked around the room. Everything you've seen today would have ended. Jean felt a weight settle in her chest. Not guilt, responsibility. She thought back to Union Station. She had almost walked away. Almost decided that 7% battery mattered more than one stranger. She reached into her pocket and removed the old phone. The cracked screen reflected sunlight pouring through the window. William looked at it quietly. I've spent decades writing checks, but that little phone accomplished something money couldn't. Jean frowned. What do you mean, you gave a stranger trust before you knew his name? You reminded me what this foundation was built on. Jean lowered her eyes. I only thought I was helping one man. William smiled gently. Sometimes we never get to choose how far kindness travels. Before Jean could answer, children's laughter drifted up from the courtyard below. Lucas was outside playing basketball with several boys he had met less than an hour earlier. Jean watched him through the window. For the first time in years, she imagined what life might have looked like if a place like this had existed when she first became a single mother. She had come expecting to see a building. Instead, she was beginning to see a future she had never dared imagine for herself. The visit to the Madison Street Community Center stayed with Jean long after she and Lucas returned home. That evening, while Lucas finished his homework at the kitchen table, Jean found herself thinking about the photographs lining the upstairs hallway. She could still remember the faces of the people whose lives had quietly changed inside those brick walls. None of them looked extraordinary. They looked like cashiers, bus drivers, nursing assistants, warehouse workers, grandparents raising grandchildren, and parents trying to keep their families together. People like her, She had spent years believing that places like that belonged to someone else's story. Now she knew they had always been built for people exactly like her. On Monday afternoon, William invited Jean to lunch before she began her evening shift. He suggested a small neighborhood diner only a few blocks from the community center. There were no private dining rooms, no security guards, and no expensive reservations. The waitress greeted William by his first name and refilled his coffee before he even asked. "You come here often?" Jean asked. William smiled. "For almost 20 years. I signed the foundation's first lease sitting in that booth." He pointed toward an old corner table by the window. Jean looked around. "You could eat anywhere." "I can." He stirred his coffee slowly. "But if success makes you forget where you started, it eventually makes you forget why you started." Those words lingered between them. After their meals arrived, William became unusually quiet. Jean sensed he was deciding whether to tell her something deeply personal. Finally, he folded his hands. "I wasn't born into money." Jean wasn't surprised. "I didn't think you were." He smiled faintly. "My father died when I was 11. My mother cleaned office buildings at night." Jean looked up immediately. "She was a janitor." He nodded. "Just like you." The restaurant seemed to fade into the background. William continued. "During the day, she slept whenever she could. At night, she cleaned downtown buildings. I used to wait for her at a community center almost identical to the one you visited." Jean leaned forward. "The staff there knew every child's name. They helped me with homework. They served dinner before my mother picked me up. They even kept spare winter coats for kids whose families couldn't afford them." He looked out the window for a moment. "My mother always said we weren't receiving charity. We were receiving time." Jean frowned gently. "What did she mean?" William smiled. "She believed money disappears. But when someone gives you knowledge, or safety, or hope, they're really giving you time you would have spent struggling alone." Jean slowly nodded. She understood that in a way no financial report ever could. William continued. "My mother worked herself into exhaustion. One winter she collapsed while cleaning an office building." Jean's expression softened. "Was she all right?" "Eventually. But her doctor told her she couldn't continue working nights forever. So she enrolled in bookkeeping classes. At the community center, Jean remembered the computer classroom they had visited. The same kind of classes. The very beginning of them." William nodded. "Back then there were only 6 students. My mother graduated. She found an office job. For the first time in our lives, she was home in the evenings." He smiled at the memory. "I finally knew what it felt like to eat dinner with her." Jean looked down at her hands. She suddenly imagined Lucas growing up without watching her leave every evening for work. The thought hurt more than she expected. William noticed. "I've seen that look before." "What look?" "The one where you're calculating what life might have been." Jean laughed quietly. "I guess I was." He shook his head. "Don't. You've already given your son something my mother gave me." "What?" "He has never doubted that someone will show up for him." Jean felt emotion tighten her throat. Every morning phone call, every packed lunch, every exhausted smile after a night shift. She had assumed those things were ordinary. To a child, perhaps they never were. After a moment, William's expression grew heavier. "I made a mistake." Jean looked at him curiously. "You? A very expensive one." "For years, I believed expanding the foundation meant opening more buildings. I spent more time reading spreadsheets than meeting families." Rebecca had joined them midway through lunch and quietly listened. She nodded. "Board meetings became about occupancy rates, maintenance costs, property values, budget forecasts. William sighed. Those things matter. But somewhere along the way, I started protecting the organization instead of protecting its purpose. Jean remembered the photographs. So when the reports said Madison Street wasn't profitable, I believed them, William finished. Yes. Rebecca opened a thin folder she had brought with her. I want to show you something. She removed 2 charts. The first displayed financial losses over 3 years. The second contained handwritten notes from employees at the center. Jean read them slowly. One note came from a volunteer. This is the only place my grandson feels safe after school. Another read, I found my first full-time job because someone here helped me practice interviews. Another simply said, you saved my family. Jean looked back at the financial report. None of those voices appeared anywhere. No, she whispered. Rebecca smiled sadly. Exactly. You can't measure hope on a spreadsheet. William folded the papers. The morning I borrowed your phone, I had just received these letters. I realized we had almost closed the center without hearing the people inside it. Jean thought about Union Station. If William's phone had not been stolen, perhaps he would never have spoken to her. If everyone had continued walking past him, perhaps the board would have signed the papers. So many tiny moments had depended on one another. She looked at William. You keep thanking me. But maybe all I did was slow things down long enough for everyone to listen. William smiled. Sometimes that's exactly what leadership is. When lunch ended, William walked Jean outside. Before she left for work, he asked one unexpected question. Have you ever thought about doing something besides cleaning offices? John laughed. Every Tuesday. I just don't know how. William looked at her thoughtfully. I think you know more than you realize. Jean shook her head. I don't have a college degree. I don't know anything about running a foundation. William watched people entering and leaving the community center across the street. No, but you understand the people we're trying to serve. He turned back toward her. And that kind of knowledge can't be taught in a classroom. Jean smiled politely, assuming he was simply being kind. She had no idea that for the first time in many years, William Carter was seriously considering inviting someone without titles, wealth, or formal credentials to help shape the future of the foundation his mother had inspired him to build. 3 days after their conversation at the diner, William Carter called Jean just after noon. As always, she had already spoken to Lucas before school. As always, their morning had ended with the same familiar words. One call can change a day. Neither of them realized how differently those words would sound before sunset. William's voice came through the old phone with its usual calm warmth. Would you have dinner with Rebecca and me this evening? John glanced at the mop bucket she had been preparing for another overnight shift. I work tonight. I've already spoken with Angela. Jean frowned. You what? William chuckled softly. Only to ask whether your shift could begin an hour later. She agreed. Jean sighed. I suppose everyone knows my schedule except me. I promise, William replied. This won't take long. That evening, they met in a quiet conference room inside the Foundation's headquarters. Unlike the polished corporate offices Jean cleaned every night, this room felt surprisingly simple. A round wooden table stood in the center. Children's artwork decorated one wall instead of framed financial awards. Rebecca poured coffee while William waited until everyone had taken a seat. I've been thinking about you, he began. Jean smiled awkwardly. I hope that's a good thing. It is. He reached beside his chair and placed a cream-colored envelope on the table. It was thick, far thicker than any ordinary letter. William gently pushed it toward her. I know this doesn't repay what you did. John looked at the envelope without touching it. What is it? A gift. You've earned far more than this. Rebecca quietly added, Please open it. Jean slowly lifted the flap. Inside was a cashier's check. Her eyes widened. She looked again, convinced she had misread the number. $50,000. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Jean carefully slid the check back into the envelope. Then she placed the envelope exactly where William had set it. "I can't accept this." William blinked. "You haven't even thought about it." "I already have." Rebecca leaned forward. "John, this isn't charity." "I know. It's gratitude." John looked at both of them before answering. "My rent is overdue. My son's medication costs more every month. My car stopped working almost a year ago." She smiled faintly. "So believe me, I know exactly what $50,000 could do." William waited quietly. She continued, "But every time I looked at that community center, I kept hearing something." "What?" William asked. "The people there weren't waiting for someone to rescue them. They were learning how to stand on their own." She rested one hand on the envelope. "If I take this, I'm afraid I'll remember the money. I'd rather remember the people." William looked at her for a long moment. "Do you know how many people would accept this check without hesitation?" John nodded. "I probably would have a few years ago." "What changed?" She smiled softly. "I met a man who reminded me that kindness isn't supposed to become a business transaction." Silence settled over the room. Rebecca quietly looked away, giving both of them space. William slowly pulled the envelope back toward himself. He did not appear offended. He appeared thoughtful. Finally, he laughed under his breath. "My mother would have liked you." Jin smiled. "I think I would have liked her." William folded the check and slipped it back into the envelope. "So tell me, if not money, what do you actually need?" Jun answered immediately. "A chance." William tilted his head. "A chance to what?" She took a deep breath. "I've spent years cleaning buildings where important decisions happen. I don't envy the people making those decisions. But I wish someone would ask people like me what life actually feels like." Rebecca listened carefully. John continued. "The women in your computer classes. The mothers working night shifts. The people trying to study after cleaning offices all night. They don't need someone handing them checks. They need employers willing to hire them. They need childcare during evening classes. They need buses that still run after midnight. They need someone who understands why missing one day of work can destroy an entire month's budget." William's expression slowly changed. He wasn't listening politely anymore. He was listening intently. Jean hadn't noticed. She simply kept talking. "When I visited the center, I saw amazing programs. But I kept wondering, what happens to the women who finish those classes?" Rebecca answered. "Some find work. Some don't." "Exactly." Jean nodded. "What if the center stayed with them longer? What if someone helped them practice interviews every week? What if local businesses agreed to offer apprenticeships? What if employers actually met the people instead of just reading resumes?" William leaned back in his chair. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked Rebecca, "Have we ever discussed anything like this?" Rebecca shook her head. "Not in this way." William smiled at Jean. "You've just redesigned one of our biggest programs." Jean looked startled. "No. I was only thinking out loud. That's usually where the best ideas begin." She laughed nervously. "I don't know anything about running non-profits." William folded his hands. "You know something more valuable." "What?" "You know where our programs stop helping." Jean's smile disappeared. She hadn't expected those words. William stood and walked toward the wall covered with children's artwork. "When people visit this foundation," he said, "they usually tell us what we've done well. You walked in and told us what we're still missing. He turned back toward her. I need more of that. Jean shook her head. I'm not qualified. William smiled. That's exactly what my mother said the first time someone offered her an office job. Rebecca laughed softly, and she ended up managing an entire accounting department. William looked back at Jean. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm only asking you not to underestimate what experience can teach. Jean glanced down at her old phone resting beside her coffee cup. The cracked screen reflected the overhead lights. She remembered every night she had scrubbed office floors while wondering whether anyone important had ever noticed the people cleaning around them. Now one of those people sat across from her, not offering rescue, but asking for her perspective. It felt strangely frightening and strangely hopeful. As they prepared to leave, William picked up the unopened envelope. I'll keep this. Jean nodded gratefully. I think that's best. He smiled. Good. Because I believe I found something much more valuable than a check. Jean looked at him curiously. What? William opened the conference room door. Someone who understands the people we've been trying to help all along. Jean walked out into the cool Chicago evening, believing the conversation had ended. She did not know that early the next morning, William would call an emergency meeting of the Foundation's executive team to discuss a new idea inspired not by consultants, economists, or board members, but by a night janitor who had refused $50,000 in exchange for the chance to change lives instead. The Foundation's executive conference room looked nothing like the community center. Instead of children's paintings, framed architectural plans lined the walls. Instead of folding tables and donated books, polished walnut furniture reflected the morning sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. Jean Brooks had spent years cleaning rooms like this after everyone had gone home. She had never imagined walking into one while people were waiting for her. She paused outside the door, smoothing the sleeves of her clean navy blouse. It wasn't new. She had bought it 3 years earlier from a thrift store for $12 because it looked professional enough for parent-teacher conferences. Today it was the nicest thing she owned. Rebecca opened the door. They're ready. John took a slow breath. I don't know why I'm more nervous than I was at Union Station. Rebecca smiled. Because back then you were helping someone else. Today you're letting people hear your own ideas. Inside, 8 members of the Carter Community Foundation Board sat around the large table. William stood rather than taking the seat at the head. I appreciate everyone coming on short notice. Thomas Green folded his hands. I understand this meeting concerns a new workforce initiative. It does, William replied, and I'd like you to hear the idea from the person who inspired it. Every head turned toward Jean. For a moment she wished she were back, pushing her janitor's cart where no one expected anything from her. William gestured toward the empty chair beside him. Please. Jean sat carefully. The silence felt enormous. William spoke first. Most of us in this room have graduate degrees. We've studied policy, finance management, and philanthropy. He looked around the table. But very few of us have experienced the problems we're trying to solve. Then he looked at John. You have? Jean cleared her throat. I honestly didn't prepare a speech. William smiled. Good. We're tired of speeches. We need honesty. Several board members exchanged curious glances. Jean rested both hands on the table to steady herself. When I visited Madison Street, she began, I met women who reminded me of myself. She looked around the room. They weren't lazy. They weren't waiting for someone to rescue them. They were exhausted. Nobody interrupted. They worked overnight. They took buses across the city. They cared for children. They studied whenever they could. They were already doing everything people tell poor families to do. She paused. But after graduation, they were still alone. Thomas leaned forward. What would you change? Jean answered almost immediately. I wouldn't end the relationship at graduation. Several people began taking notes. If someone finishes a training program, help them prepare for interviews. Introduce them to employers. Check on them after 30 days. After 90 days. After 6 months. Rebecca nodded quietly. Jean continued. And offer evening childcare. One board member frowned. That would increase costs significantly. Jean nodded. It would. But how many mothers miss class because they can't afford a babysitter? Nobody answered. How many women quit because the last bus leaves before class ends? Again, silence. Jean looked toward William. You asked what people like me need. We don't need another certificate sitting in a drawer. We need someone to walk with us until our first real paycheck. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, a gray-haired board member spoke. How do we know that would actually improve outcomes? Before Jean could answer, William did. Because every successful person in this room had someone who stayed with them longer than one meeting, the room grew still. Thomas looked thoughtfully at John. If this program existed 5 years ago, what would it have changed for you? Jean smiled sadly. I wouldn't have spent 3 years believing that cleaning office buildings was the only job I was qualified to do. She continued more softly. I might have believed I deserved to apply somewhere else. Those words settled over everyone. Rebecca broke the silence. We've spent years measuring graduation rates. We've never measured confidence. William nodded. Perhaps we've been tracking the wrong success. Over the next hour, the conversation became less formal. Jean described what it felt like to leave work at 5 in the morning. She explained why a single missed paycheck terrified working parents. She talked about employers who rejected applicants simply because they had no recent office experience. Instead of dismissing her ideas, more and more board members asked questions. How many evenings should mentoring continue? Would volunteer professionals help? Could local businesses partner with the foundation? Jean answered honestly whenever she knew. When she didn't, she simply said, I don't know. William noticed something important. Unlike many consultants, John never pretended to have every answer. She simply understood the questions that mattered. By lunchtime, a rough outline filled the whiteboard. Career mentoring, interview coaching, employer partnerships, evening childcare, transportation assistance, 90-day follow-up. Rebecca stepped back to look at the board. We've never designed a program this way. William smiled. No. We've never started by asking the people living the problem. After the meeting ended, everyone slowly filed out. Thomas remained behind. Jean wondered whether she had said something wrong. Instead, he walked over and extended his hand. You challenged several assumptions I've held for years. Jean shook his hand. I hope respectfully. You did. He smiled. And that's probably why I listened. Once the room emptied, William poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Jean. You know, he said, I offered you $50,000 because I thought I was rewarding your kindness. Jean smiled over the rim of the cup. And now I think that would have been the cheaper choice. She laughed. I'm not sure I understand. William looked at the whiteboard still covered with ideas. If your program works, hundreds of mothers may find better jobs. Hundreds of children may see their parents at dinner instead of only before sunrise. He paused. That's worth much more than any check. Jean looked through the conference room window toward the city skyline. For the first time in years, she imagined her own future without automatically picturing a mop bucket or a vacuum cleaner. Not because she was ashamed of honest work, but because someone had finally asked her to build something, instead of simply maintaining it. As she picked up her old phone from the conference table, the cracked screen caught the afternoon light. A notification appeared. One missed call. Lucas. She immediately called him back. He answered on the first ring. Hi, Mom. Jean smiled. Hi, buddy. How'd your meeting go? She looked one last time at the whiteboard filled with possibilities. Then she answered with quiet certainty. I think one call just changed another day. The proposal spread through Carter Community Foundation faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, copies of Jun's recommendations sat on nearly every executive's desk. Some employees were excited. Others were skeptical. A few quietly dismissed the entire idea before reading the second page. One sentence kept appearing in hallway conversations. Who is Jun Brooks? Some asked with genuine curiosity. Others asked with unmistakable doubt. On Tuesday morning, Rebecca walked into William's office carrying a stack of printed emails. You should probably read these. William adjusted his glasses. Good news or bad? A little of both. He scanned the first message. Interesting concept. Worth exploring. The second. Additional mentoring could significantly improve long-term outcomes. The third was much shorter. With respect, why are we redesigning programs based on the opinions of a janitor? William stopped reading. He looked up slowly. Rebecca watched his expression. I thought you'd want to know. William folded the papers neatly. I do. He remained silent for several seconds. Then he stood and looked through the office window toward downtown Chicago. You know what troubles me? Rebecca waited. Not that someone questioned Jean. That they questioned her because of her job. That afternoon, William announced another meeting. This time, department directors, board members, and several program managers attended. Jean wasn't invited. She didn't even know it was happening. William stood before the room without slides or prepared notes. I've received concerns, he began. Some people believe we're placing too much weight on ideas from someone without formal credentials. Nobody spoke. Thomas Green shifted slightly in his chair, but kept his eyes forward. William continued. I'd like to ask everyone a simple question. He picked up a photograph from the Madison Street Community Center. It showed a classroom filled with children. Who understands these families better? He looked around the room. The consultant who studied poverty for 20 years? Or the mother who has lived it every day? Silence. William nodded. I respect education. I value expertise. But experience is also expertise. Thomas finally raised his hand. I'd like to say something. William gestured for him to continue. Thomas stood slowly. I was one of the people who questioned this. Several faces turned toward him. I've spent 30 years evaluating programs. I've built my career on measurable outcomes. He paused. Then Jean asked us one question. He looked around the room. What happens after graduation? Thomas smiled faintly. I realized I couldn't answer. A quiet murmur moved through the room. He continued. We've measured enrollment. We've measured completion. We've measured attendance. But we never followed enough people long enough. Rebecca projected several reports onto the screen. Our data confirms that. Many graduates disappear from our records after receiving certificates. William spoke gently. We celebrated programs ending. Jean asked why we weren't celebrating lives improving. No one argued. Meanwhile, John's own life continued almost exactly as before. At 9:15 that evening, she pushed her janitor's cart across the 31st floor of the office building. She emptied recycling bins. She disinfected conference tables. She vacuumed hallways that would be filled again in just a few hours. Nothing about her daily routine suggested she had influenced the direction of a multi-million-dollar foundation. Angela Morris caught up with her near the elevators. You've been smiling a lot lately. Jean laughed. Have I? You have. Angela leaned against the wall. I don't know what's going on with you and that businessman. But whatever it is, I'm glad. Jean looked down at the mop handle in her hands. I don't think anything's really changed. Angela smiled knowingly. That's where you're wrong. Jean looked puzzled. You still clean floors? You still catch the train home? You still worry about paying bills? Angela shrugged. But now when you talk, you sound like someone who believes tomorrow might be different. Jean didn't answer immediately. Perhaps Angela was right. Hope had quietly entered her life without asking permission. The next morning after dropping Lucas at school, Jean received another call from William. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I was wondering if you'd stop by the foundation this afternoon. Jean smiled. Another meeting? No. This one's much smaller. Curious, she agreed. When she arrived, William and Rebecca were waiting in a modest meeting room. No board members, no executives. Only 3 chairs. William handed Jean a folder. She opened it. Inside was a draft proposal titled Pathways Forward Initiative. Beneath the title appeared several sections she immediately recognized. Career mentors, employer partnerships, interview coaching, transportation support, evening childcare, 90-day follow-up. Jean looked up. You actually wrote all of this. Rebecca smiled. We refined it. But the heart of it is yours. Jean turned another page. Near the bottom, one sentence caught her attention. Program Development Advisor. She frowned. What is this? William folded his hands. We'd like you to help us build it. Jean laughed nervously. I think you overestimate me. I don't. You've never managed a nonprofit. No. You've never supervised a statewide program. No. You've never written grant proposals. Jean shook her head. No. William smiled. But every idea in this proposal came from someone who has lived the problem. He leaned forward. We can teach paperwork. We can teach budgets. We cannot teach authenticity. Jean stared at the folder. I still have my cleaning job. You should keep it. She looked surprised. For now. William nodded. I don't want to pull you away from the life you're describing. I want you to help us understand it. Rebecca added gently, work with us a few hours each week. Keep your job. See whether this feels right. Jean slowly closed the folder. She wasn't being offered charity. She wasn't being rescued. She was being trusted. It felt strangely heavier than accepting $50,000. She looked at William. What if I fail? He smiled with the same quiet confidence she had first seen at Union Station. Then we'll learn. But I don't think that's what you're really afraid of. Jean lowered her eyes. He was right. She wasn't afraid of failing. She was afraid of believing she belonged somewhere she had spent her entire life assuming was reserved for other people. As she left the foundation that afternoon, the old phone vibrated in her coat pocket. Lucas had sent a simple text from school. How's your day going? Mom Jean smiled and typed back. Better than I ever expected. Then she slipped the phone into her pocket and walked toward the train station, unaware that the small role she had just accepted would soon place her face to face with dozens of women whose stories sounded almost exactly like her own. Jean's life settled into a rhythm unlike anything she had ever known. 3 nights each week, she still cleaned office buildings from evening until dawn. Her gray janitor's cart rolled through the same polished hallways, and she still greeted the security guards by name. The work remained honest, familiar, and necessary. 2 afternoons each week, however, she crossed the city to the Madison Street Community Center, carrying a notebook instead of cleaning supplies. She wasn't there to teach. She wasn't there to supervise. She was there to listen. William insisted on that. The first version of every program, he told her, should be written by the people who need it. So Jean began asking questions. The first workshop brought together 12 women. Some worked in nursing homes. Some stocked grocery shelves overnight. One drove a city bus. Another cleaned hotel rooms. The youngest participant was 23. The oldest had just turned 56. Every one of them carried the same tired expression Jean had once seen in her own bathroom mirror. Jean stood before them, suddenly feeling nervous. Rebecca whispered, "Just be yourself." Jean smiled. "I don't really know how to give speeches." A few women laughed. "So let's skip that." The room relaxed immediately. Instead of beginning with presentations or printed materials, Jean picked up a marker and wrote one question across the whiteboard. "What is the hardest part of starting over?" For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Then a woman in the front row slowly raised her hand. "My name's Emily Foster." Jean smiled. "Nice to meet you, Emily." Emily looked down at the floor. "I can learn new skills. I can work hard. But every interview asks why I stayed in housekeeping for 11 years. They look at me like I stopped growing." Jean nodded slowly. "What do you tell them?" "The truth. My husband left. I had 2 little girls. I took the first job I could find." She shrugged. "They smile politely. Then they hire someone else." Several women around the room quietly nodded. Another participant spoke. "My problem isn't interviews. It's childcare. My classes finish at 8. The daycare closes at 6. Someone else added, "I work overnight. I sleep while everyone else is awake. I don't even know when I'm supposed to attend networking events." Within half an hour, the whiteboard filled with problems no spreadsheet had ever captured. Transportation, childcare, confidence, references, work clothes, interview anxiety, lack of professional contacts. Jean looked around the room. Every challenge sounded practical. None of them sounded impossible. People simply needed someone willing to connect the missing pieces. After the workshop ended, William entered carrying a tray of coffee. "How did it go?" Jean pointed toward the crowded whiteboard. "We've been solving the wrong problems." William read every line carefully. Then he smiled. "No. We've been asking the wrong questions." The following week, Jean suggested something unexpected. Instead of inviting career coaches to speak first, she wanted graduates from previous programs to return and tell their own stories. Rebecca loved the idea. Within days, former participants began arriving. One woman described how she had failed 7 interviews before receiving an offer. Another admitted she had cried in the parking lot before every interview because she believed she wasn't good enough. Those honest confessions changed the atmosphere more than any motivational speech. Emily sat quietly through all of it. After one session, Jean found her alone in the hallway, staring at a bulletin board covered with job postings. "You okay?" Emily laughed nervously. "I almost left after the first hour." "Why?" "I figured everyone else had their life together." Jean smiled. "Did you—" Emily shook her head. "No. They're just better at hiding the fear." Jean laughed softly. "We all are." Emily looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you end up working with Mr. Carter?" Jean glanced down at the cracked phone resting in her hand. "I let a stranger borrow this." Emily blinked. "That's it." Jean smiled. "That's how it started." She didn't mention the attorneys, or the foundation, or the $2 million decision. Instead, she said something she believed mattered more. "I helped someone because they needed help. The rest happened one step at a time." Emily looked thoughtful. "I keep waiting for one big opportunity." Jean shook her head gently. "I don't think life usually works that way. It gives us small moments and asks what kind of person we want to be." Those words stayed with Emily. Several weeks later, another meeting brought unexpected news. Rebecca projected updated enrollment numbers. Attendance has increased by 38%. A board member smiled. Excellent, Rebecca continued. But that's not the biggest change. She displayed another chart. 92% of participants now complete interview preparation. Mentor participation has doubled. Volunteer employers have increased from 6 to 19. The room filled with quiet excitement. William turned toward John. You've only been here 2 months. Jean laughed. I mostly ask questions. Rebecca smiled. Exactly. Thomas Green nodded in agreement. We used to design programs around our assumptions. Now we're designing them around conversations. One afternoon, as John prepared to leave the center for her night shift, she found Lucas sitting in the children's reading room. He was helping 2 younger boys build a tower from wooden blocks. One little boy accidentally knocked the tower over. He immediately looked embarrassed. Before Jean could say anything, Lucas smiled. It's okay. We'll build it again. Jean watched from the doorway. William quietly walked beside her. He sounds familiar. Jean smiled. I wonder where he learned that. William looked at Lucas for a long moment. Probably from watching someone rebuild every day. Jean followed his gaze. She suddenly realized something. For years she had believed Lucas only saw her struggles. He had actually been watching her resilience. As they left the building together, Emily ran outside carrying an envelope. Jean, she was breathing hard. I wanted you to know before anyone else. She handed over the envelope. Inside was a letter. Offer of employment, administrative assistant, full-time, benefits included. Emily's hands trembled. I got the job. Jean looked up, her eyes filling with tears. You did? Emily laughed through her tears. They said my interview felt real? Jean hugged her tightly. No. You were real. William watched quietly from the entrance of the center. One job offer would never make newspaper headlines. It would never appear in an annual report as a major financial achievement. Yet he understood something the Foundation had forgotten for far too long. Every single life changed was its own kind of success, and as Jeanne slipped her old phone back into her pocket, she realized the crack across its screen no longer reminded her of hardship. It reminded her that even something imperfect could become the beginning of someone else's future. 2 years passed more quickly than Jean Brooks ever imagined possible. The seasons changed outside the windows of the Madison Street Community Center, but inside something even more remarkable was changing. People were no longer arriving with only uncertainty. Many were returning with confidence. The bulletin board near the entrance had once been covered mostly with flyers asking for help. Now it displayed photographs, graduates standing beside their first office desks, parents holding apartment keys, small business owners smiling in front of newly opened storefronts, children wearing college sweatshirts. Each photograph represented a beginning rather than an ending. Jean often paused before walking into her office studying the growing collection. She never allowed herself to forget that every picture had started with someone's difficult first day. Her own office remained surprisingly modest. A second-hand wooden desk, 2 bookshelves, a coffee mug Lucas had painted in middle school, and sitting beside her computer every day, the old phone with the cracked screen. She no longer depended on it for work. William had insisted the Foundation provide her with a new phone after she officially became Director of Workforce Partnerships 6 months earlier. Jean accepted the new phone for business, but the old one never left her desk. Whenever someone asked why she kept a broken phone instead of displaying awards or certificates, she always smiled. Because this is where everything began. One bright April morning, Rebecca knocked gently on Jean's office door. You have a minute? Jean looked up from reviewing mentoring reports. Always. Rebecca carried a thick blue binder. I thought you'd want to see this before tomorrow's board meeting. Jean opened it. The first page contained numbers. She smiled. You know I still read the stories before the statistics. Rebecca laughed. I know. So start with page 12. June turned the pages. Instead of charts, she found handwritten letters. One came from Emily Foster. 2 years earlier, Emily had walked into the center believing no employer would ever look beyond her housekeeping experience. Now she supervised the administrative department of a regional healthcare clinic. Her letter read, You taught me that I didn't need a different past. I needed a different future. Another letter came from a former warehouse worker who had completed evening bookkeeping classes. Another from a father who had finally found daytime work after years of overnight shifts. Jean quietly closed the binder. I still can't believe these are real people. Rebecca smiled. They're very real. And they all wanted you to read their letters. Later that afternoon, William invited Jean to walk through the neighborhood surrounding the community center. Many storefronts looked different now. An empty bakery had reopened. A childcare center occupied what had once been an abandoned laundromat. 2 small cafes employed graduates from the workforce program. William stopped across the street and looked back toward the community center. Do you notice anything? Jean looked carefully. More people. Exactly. More families stay here instead of moving away. He pointed toward the small businesses lining the block. When parents find stable jobs, they spend money close to home. Neighborhood businesses grow. More businesses hire local workers. The entire community changes. Jean smiled. It's like planting one tree. And eventually finding an entire forest. William laughed. I wish I'd thought of that. The following morning brought the Foundation's annual impact meeting. Unlike previous years, the auditorium was filled not only with board members, but also volunteers, mentors, employers, former students, and community leaders. Jean sat quietly near the back. She preferred listening to speaking. Rebecca stepped to the podium first. For many years, she began, we measured success by buildings grants and annual budgets. She clicked the remote. Photographs replaced financial charts. Children, families, graduates, new employees, new business owners. We've learned to measure something different. Applause filled the room. Then William approached the podium carrying a thin folder. He looked older than when Jean had first met him in Union Station. His hair had become almost completely silver, but his voice remained steady. 2 years ago, he began, I borrowed a phone. Soft laughter rippled through the audience. I thought that phone call saved a community center. He paused. I was wrong. Everyone looked toward him. It helped save the way we think. The auditorium became completely quiet. William continued. For decades we invested in buildings. Now we invest in relationships. For decades we asked how many people entered our programs. Now we ask how many no longer need them. He opened the folder. I'd like to share this year's results. A large screen illuminated behind him. More than 300 children had participated in after-school education. Over 470 parents had completed career transition programs. 312 graduates had secured full-time employment with benefits. 46 small businesses had partnered with the Foundation. 78 volunteer mentors now served participants throughout the city. Then came the final figure. Over the last 2 years, the Foundation had committed more than $2 million to expanding workforce development, childcare support transportation assistance, mentoring, and neighborhood employment partnerships inspired by the new initiative. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Jean remained still. Only then did she truly understand the title of her own story. The phone call had never been worth $2 million. The opportunity it protected had become worth far more than that, not because of money, because of people. William looked directly toward Jean. I've been asked many times why we invested so heavily in this program. He smiled warmly. My answer is always the same. Because one woman reminded us that the most valuable investment isn't property. It's potential. When the meeting ended, dozens of former participants approached Jean. Emily hugged her first. I brought someone. She turned toward a young woman standing nervously beside her. This is Kayla. She starts our mentoring program next Monday. Kayla smiled shyly. Emily told me I needed to meet the woman who changed her life. Jean immediately shook her head. No. Emily changed her own life. I just walked beside her for a little while. Emily laughed. You still don't know how to take credit. Jean smiled. I don't think it was ever mine to take. As everyone gradually left the auditorium, Jean remained behind for a moment. She reached into her handbag and gently touched the cracked phone resting inside. It suddenly occurred to her that hundreds of families had been helped because on one ordinary morning she had decided not to keep the last few % of battery for herself. Sometimes the smallest choice became the largest legacy. It was nearly 7 o'clock on a cool October morning when June Brooks found herself standing once again beneath the great arched ceiling of Chicago's Union Station. She hadn't planned to stop there. A meeting across town had been canceled at the last minute, and instead of taking the faster subway route back to the foundation, she decided to walk through the station where everything had begun. Nearly 3 years had passed. The building looked almost exactly the same. Commuters hurried across polished stone floors. Announcements echoed overhead. Coffee shops overflowed with customers clutching paper cups. Travelers hurried toward platforms without looking up. Only Jean had changed. She wore a tailored navy coat over business clothes instead of the faded work jacket she had once worn after night shifts. Around her neck hung an employee badge identifying her as Director of Workforce Partnerships. Yet tucked inside her handbag remained the same cracked phone. She carried it everywhere, not because she needed it, because she never wanted to forget who she had been. As she walked toward the central concourse, her phone vibrated. It was Lucas. Now 12 years old, his voice had begun changing. Morning, Mom. Jean smiled automatically. Morning, buddy. You ready for your history test? I studied. What do we always say? Lucas laughed. One call can change a day. It sure can. I'll see you tonight. Love you. Love you too. Jean slipped the phone into her pocket. The familiar ritual still grounded both of them. She had barely taken another dozen steps when she heard a voice behind her. Excuse me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. But something about it immediately pulled her backward through time. She turned. A young woman, perhaps 25 years old, stood near one of the station columns. She wore a restaurant uniform beneath an oversized coat that couldn't quite hide the fact she was several months pregnant. One hand rested protectively on her stomach. The other held a folded piece of paper. I'm sorry to bother you, she said. My phone died. I just need to call my sister. I've been asking people. She glanced toward the crowd. But nobody will stop. Jean slowly looked around. The scene felt hauntingly familiar. People hurried past without slowing. One businessman waved the woman away before she had even finished speaking. A couple avoided eye contact. Someone muttered, "Not today." The young woman's shoulders lowered slightly after each rejection. Jean noticed something else. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking for money. Only one phone call. Jean felt the old phone inside her handbag. The memory arrived so vividly that it almost stole her breath. William. 7% battery. 2 minutes. One choice. Without another thought, she reached into her bag. Instead of taking out her newer smartphone, she removed the old cracked phone. She had charged it the night before out of habit. The battery displayed 94%. She smiled. It's your lucky day. The young woman blinked. You'll let me use it? Of course. The woman accepted it carefully. Thank you. Jean watched as she dialed from memory. After only one ring, someone answered. The woman's face immediately softened. Megan, it's me. I'm okay. I missed the train. My phone died. I just needed you to know. Jean quietly looked away to give her privacy. The conversation lasted barely a minute. When the woman returned, the phone, tears glistened in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Jean smiled. You already did. The young woman looked confused. You reminded me of someone. Before she could explain further, William Carter's voice called from behind. I had a feeling I'd find you here. Jean turned. William approached with Rebecca walking beside him. His pace had slowed with age, and he now carried a polished wooden cane, though more for balance than necessity. He noticed the phone in Jean's hand. Then he looked toward the young woman walking away. A knowing smile crossed his face. You lent it again? Jean laughed. I didn't even think. No, you didn't. William looked around the station. That's the beautiful part. The first time, kindness was a decision. The second time, it had become part of who you are. Jean watched the young woman disappear into the crowd. I almost told her what happened here. William shook his head gently. I'm glad you didn't. Why? Because kindness doesn't need to know its own history. Rebecca smiled. She'll tell her own story someday. The three of them walked slowly toward a quiet seating area overlooking the main hall. William lowered himself onto a bench. I've been coming here every year since that morning. Jean looked surprised. You have? He nodded. Just to remember. What? That no amount of success protects you from needing another human being. Jean sat beside him. And no amount of hardship prevents someone from helping. William smiled. Exactly. For several minutes, they simply watched people moving through the station. Thousands of strangers, thousands of separate lives, any one of them carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. William finally broke the silence. Do you know the only thing I regret? Jean looked at him. I never thanked the hundreds of people who quietly helped my mother. He tapped his cane lightly against the floor. I spent years trying to repay them with buildings. But maybe the best repayment, he glanced toward the woman Jean had just helped, is making sure kindness keeps moving. Jean reached into her handbag once more. She looked at the cracked phone resting in her hands. The fracture across the screen still caught the morning light, exactly as it had years before. It was no longer a reminder of poverty. It had become a reminder of possibility. She smiled quietly. You know, I used to think this phone changed my life. William raised an eyebrow. And now, Jean watched another train arrive. Passengers poured onto the platform, some smiling, some exhausted, some carrying hope, some carrying worry. I think, she said softly, it only reminded me that every ordinary person gets the chance to change someone else's. William nodded. And that's worth more than any fortune. Together they sat in comfortable silence as another morning rush flowed around them, unaware that somewhere in the city a young pregnant waitress had just arrived safely, because one woman had once learned that sometimes the smallest act of trust could begin a circle of kindness that never truly ends. 5 years after that unforgettable morning at Union Station, the Madison Street Community Center looked almost nothing like the building William Carter had nearly lost. The original brick structure still stood proudly at its heart, but a bright new wing extended behind it, filled with classrooms, childcare facilities, interview rooms, and a technology lab where teenagers learned coding after school. The expansion had not erased the past. It had honored it. Children still ran through the same front entrance. Volunteers still greeted newcomers by name. Fresh soup still filled the community kitchen every afternoon, only now more people found hope inside those walls than ever before. On a crisp Saturday morning, hundreds of guests gathered outside the building for the dedication of the new Community Opportunity Center. Neighbors filled folding chairs, former students returned with their children, employers stood beside volunteers. City officials attended quietly without dominating the event. For William, this was never about politics. It was about people. Jean arrived early with Lucas. Lucas was now a confident high school freshman, taller than his mother by several inches. He carried himself with the same calm kindness Jean had shown all his life. As they walked toward the entrance, Emily Foster hurried over, wearing a navy blazer and an employee badge. "I have someone who wants to meet you." Standing beside her was a nervous young woman holding the hand of a little boy. Emily smiled. "This is Kayla." Jean immediately recognized the name. The pregnant waitress from Union Station, the woman she had helped with the old phone. Kayla smiled shyly. "You probably don't remember me." Jean laughed. "I remember." "You called your sister?" Kayla nodded. "I did. My son decided to arrive 4 weeks early." She looked down at the little boy beside her. "If I hadn't reached my sister that morning..." Her voice caught. "I don't know what would have happened." Jean knelt beside the little boy. "What's your name?" "Michael." He smiled proudly. "My mommy says strangers can become blessings." Jean looked up at Kayla. "You've been coming here?" "For almost 3 years." Kayla nodded. "I finished the bookkeeping program. I'm the assistant manager at a logistics company now." She smiled through grateful tears. "And next month, I'm volunteering here on Saturdays." Jean felt emotion rise quietly inside her. The circle had continued again. Not because anyone planned it, because kindness naturally searched for another place to land. Music began playing softly from speakers near the stage. Rebecca approached the microphone. She welcomed the community before inviting William to speak. The audience rose in applause as he slowly walked to the podium with his polished wooden cane. Age had softened his voice, but not its warmth. He looked over the crowd for several moments before speaking. "When I was 11 years old, my mother cleaned office buildings every night." Many people in the audience had heard the story before, yet they listened as though hearing it for the first time. "A community center gave us more than assistance. It gave us time. It gave my mother a chance. It gave me a future." He paused. "Years later, I almost forgot that." His eyes found Jean sitting beside Lucas. "Until one ordinary woman reminded me." The audience turned toward Jean. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the attention. William smiled. "The newspapers wrote that one phone call protected more than $2 million. He shook his head gently. They misunderstood. The money wasn't what mattered. It was what the money finally reached. He stepped away from the podium. Instead of returning to his chair, he walked toward a table covered by a blue cloth. Rebecca carefully removed the cloth. The audience fell silent. Inside, a handcrafted walnut display case rested an old cell phone. The screen remained cracked across the upper right corner, exactly as it had been years before. Beneath it, engraved into a brushed brass plate, were simple words, "One call can change a day." William lifted the display case with both hands. Then he walked directly to Jean. "I wanted to buy you a new phone." The audience laughed softly. "You refused." "I wanted to write you a large check." "You refused that too." He smiled. "So I finally found a gift you couldn't give back." Jean's eyes filled with tears. She accepted the display case carefully. It felt far heavier than its weight, not because of glass or wood, because of memory. William looked at her. "Would you read the inscription on the back?" Jean turned the case over. Another engraved message appeared. Sometimes one call changes thousands of lives. Below those words was a second line. Thank you for answering. Jean couldn't speak for several moments. Finally, she looked up. I didn't save this place. William smiled. No. You reminded us why it deserved saving. The audience stood together in a long, heartfelt ovation. Lucas quietly wiped tears from his eyes. He wasn't embarrassed. He was proud. After the ceremony ended, families filled every corner of the expanded center. Children painted murals. Volunteers served lunch. Mentors met with job seekers. Music drifted through the courtyard. Jean slipped away for a few quiet minutes. She carried the display case into the original reading room where Lucas had once helped another little boy sound out words. The room looked almost exactly the same. She placed the display case on a bookshelf. Nearby sat dozens of children's books waiting for Monday afternoon. She smiled. The phone belonged there. Not in her office, not in her home. Right where new stories would begin. A little girl wandered into the room holding a picture book upside down. She looked at Jean. Can you help me read this? Jean smiled exactly as she had years ago when strangers had needed her. Of course. She sat beside the child. Outside the window, William watched quietly before turning to Rebecca. You were right. Rebecca smiled. About what? The best investments don't earn interest. They earn people. Rebecca nodded. And those people help someone else. William looked through the window one final time. Jean was already helping another child. No cameras surrounded her. No reporters asked questions. She wasn't trying to inspire anyone. She was simply being herself. Exactly as she had been on that crowded morning at Union Station. Some stories ended with fortunes. Others ended with fame. Jean Brooks's story ended the way it had always been meant to, with one ordinary person choosing once again to stop walking long enough to see someone everyone else had passed by. Every day gives us opportunities that seem too small to matter. A smile, a few minutes of our time, a listening ear, or even something as simple as sharing a phone can become the turning point in another person's life. Most of the time, we never discover the full impact of our kindness, and perhaps we are not meant to. The value of compassion is not measured by how much recognition it brings, but by how many lives quietly become better because someone cared. Jean never imagined that a cracked old phone would become a symbol of hope for an entire community. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't powerful. She simply chose empathy over convenience. That single decision created a chain of generosity that reached children, parents, workers, and families she would never fully know. Maybe that's how the world changes, not through one grand heroic act, but through countless ordinary people refusing to ignore someone in need. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us about a small act of kindness that changed your life. Your story might encourage someone else to keep believing in people. And if you'd like to hear more inspiring journeys like Jean's, we'd love to have you subscribe and become part of our growing community.